series Fairfax County Stories by Lady Fairfax 2009, Filipino-American Corazon Sandoval Foley. Today's program is scheduled for July 2011 to help celebrate America's Independence Day with stories of the courage and sacrifice that Americans have made to preserve our democratic values. This particular episode honors the World War II stories of a member of the greatest generation, Daniel Foley Jr., my father-in-law. In 2011, I published this book entitled Long Ago and Far Away, The World War II Diary of Daniel Foley Jr. of Vallejo, California. Daniel Foley Jr. was born on February 14, 1924 in Vallejo, California, and died on August 24, 2003 in Lakeport, California. He left us with his World War II diary with this following note: "I've enjoyed retracing these travels. I only hope that my grandkids or their children enjoy this book a little, if ever they stumble over it in their attic on some faraway day." So I decided to edit this book for my grandson and his great-grandson, Daniel Padraig Foley Jr., whom you saw wearing the t-shirt, The Quarter Asian Sensation. The only son of Daniel Foley Jr. is Michael Daniel Foley, my husband. Our son, Joshua Daniel Foley, is the only grandson of Daniel Foley Jr. As I said, in 2010, I edited and printed the World War II diary of Daniel Foley Jr. as a Christmas gift to our family and dedicated it to his great-grandchild and namesake, Daniel Padraig Foley, sixth generation of the California Foleys, and our first Daniel Foley, born in Fairfax County, Virginia. I learned a lot in editing my father-in-law's World War II diary, and I decided to publish it so that I could donate it to the libraries of Fairfax County. That way, the generation of his great-grandchild, Daniel Padraig Foley, and the future would have the opportunity to share his experiences and perhaps understand the patriotism and courage of the World War II generation of Daniel Foley Jr. For today's episode, I am very pleased that my husband, Michael Daniel Foley, has very kindly agreed to read some excerpts in the words of his father, Daniel Foley Jr., as written in his World War II diary. Mike's book reading is accompanied by photos and illustrations from the World War II diary, as well as photos and videos from Memorial Day 2011 ceremony in Fairfax City that was sponsored by the veterans of Fairfax Blue and Gray, VFW Post 8469, and American Legion Post 177. I also included photos and a video from the Memorial Day Mass at Fairfax Memorial Park in Fairfax County, where a gravesite marker has been installed in honor of Daniel Foley Jr. So let us now join my husband, Mike, in his reading of the World War II diary of his father, Daniel Foley Jr.
Passed since these events transpired. My wartime diaries are falling apart, would soon be in shambles. The maps and sketches of the era were tattered and torn, and if I was to preserve anything, the whole mess needed reorganizing. Not to be ignored either, I suppose, was the opportunity to relive these memories. It's pleasant to revisit the sites of some of these old adventures. However, it is impossible to capture the mood of the original adventure, so actually revisitation is a lesson in futility. To illustrate my point, I was fortunate enough to return to Manoa in 1977. And although I was on the very site of one of my former escapades, I realized then that I could never recapture the feeling of Manoa in 1945, nor would I want to. Physically, of course, there had been so many changes that I was able to identify only one building in the whole skyline, but gone with the confidence and cares of youth. I had a whole new set of problems and advantages. It was a different world. Thus, it was evident to me that the closest thing to reliving these past travels was not by attempting to revisit the actual sites, but renewing my acquaintance with these adventures in my book. I have copied my diaries and maps and sketches, but I have carefully avoided rewriting them, since that would only destroy some of the elusive mood that could never be recaptured. Believe me, there is certainly no attempt to glorify war here. I've seen too much anguish and ruin for this. I wouldn't take $1 million for the experiences, but I wouldn't do it again for $1 million. I enjoyed retracing these travels. I only hope my grandkids or their children enjoy this book a little, if ever they stumble over it and they're at it on some faraway day.
Okay, this is John Foley, the grandfather of Daniel Foley. This is the Foley family. And this is Joshua getting married, Foley's and Hannah's. And this is Daniel Patrick Foley, first Daniel Foley born in Fairfax County.
The wartime diary of my father, Dan Foley Jr. This is his forward. This is my World War II diary. It was written in longhand version as soon as possible after the event itself. Then it was typewritten and later put on a computer. This version contains all the text and has been verified by unit histories, newspapers, magazines, or on my own personal observations. I dedicate this diary to Royden Kinsman and Dick Lang, who had the dubious honor of being the first Vallejoans to die in the service of their country during World War II. They went down aboard the USS Arizona at Pearl Harbor. Although they were a few years older than me, I became acquainted with them at the Vallejo YMCA camp on the Eel River. They had joined the Navy to see the world and died and were off to band in the first hours of the war. Another friend of mine from Vallejo High School days lived at Pearl Harbor, where his father commanded a cruiser squadron. Luckily, they were at sea during the attack. Still another close, lifelong chum, Kara thought, was the son of a Navy draftsman attached to Pearl Harbor Navy Yard on a temporary transfer from Mare Island. With all these personal ties, I was definitely not one of the many Americans who in early December of 1941 needed an atlas to locate the territory of Hawaii. The situation had gone from mediocre to bad to worse and was fast approaching desperate when in May of '42 I enlisted in the Army Air Corps. Upon enlisting, I was told that because of a lack of training facilities, I probably wouldn't be called to active duty before the year's end. At last, on February 10th, 1943, I was activated. However, we had seen what Churchill called the end of the beginning by this time, and Midway, Stalingrad, and El Alamein had passed into history. The Axis powers didn't realize it, but along with this change in their fortune, they now had to contend with Foley. As a navigator in San Antonio and being commissioned, my father went on to Sioux City, Iowa, which is where we pick up the story. Sioux City, unsuitable as it seems, their grand adventure began in Sioux City stockyards. In retrospect, though, there were a few times when the grand adventure was anything but grand. It didn't seem incongruent at all to have the thing start amid the slaughterhouses. We had become very much of a single unit, and our 10-man crew was much more of a team than before, thanks to the countless practice missions of Sioux City. Unlike the Army or Navy, or even the ground elements of the Air Force, an officer felt much closer to a sergeant or his crew than any other brother officer, and it worked like guys with non-coms. Our crew was as follows: pilot, Tom Gallagher, First Lieutenant, Brooklyn, New York; co-pilot, Jim Walsh; Second Lieutenant, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Navigator, Dan Foley, Second Lieutenant, Vallejo, California. Bombardier, Jim Atkinson, Second Lieutenant, Abilene, Texas. Engineer, Lou Vingo, Tech Sergeant, Spokane, Washington. Radio man, Bob Miner, Staff Sergeant, Kenosha, Wisconsin. Forward gunner, Jim Ekman, Staff Sergeant, Marlborough, Massachusetts. Waist gunner, Ernie Fibush, Staff Sergeant, San Francisco, California. Waist gunner, Bob Kincaid, Staff Sergeant, Chula Vista, California. Tail gunner, Bill Moore, Staff Sergeant, Fulton, New York. Of course, there were eventually some changes to this lineup, and the names changed here and there. Crew flew their plane up through Canada, Gander, and ice went over, and then we're arriving on the European coast in Ireland. Our first view of Europe was the green fields of Ireland along the shore of Donegal Bay, and this was only through a break in the clouds. However, the soup soon enveloped us again, and Gallagher flew the beam into Nuts Corner. Gallagher and Wash flew over Loch Erin and Loch Neg, and the tower instructed us to let down straight through the clouds over Loch Neg, and we broke into the Queer at about 150 feet. There were 3 airfields on the shores of the lake. This gave Gal and Walsh trouble. My map didn't even show them. I was no help, but Gal buzzed one of the strips after he'd flown over all 3. Some flares shot up, and we landed on a very, very short strip at 19 hours. We'd flown the big hop. Half an hour after our landing in Nuts Corner, our plane had been gassed up and flown out of our lives. That was the last we saw of it. In spite of her kinks, it would have been nice to fly her in combat. She didn't have many faults. After all the conniving and trickery and deceit we got to bring tequila, brandy, and bourbon over, we had it in the chin turret. The goodies were gone before our plane. The ground crew knew just where to look and ignored my camera and other paraphernalia and helped themselves. Many of the ticks of 1,000 pests infest their armpits and the stinkers. We were quartered in a Nissen hut, and after pilot and navigator interrogation, we cleaned up for dinner. I didn't realize how tired I was, but I stretched out and waiting for Gal to finish writing a note home, and I fell asleep. I not only missed dinner, but I missed the next meal as well. I looked around me at the Irish countryside, really for the first time since being on the ground. Everything was a beautiful emerald green. Everything had a pruned and mown look. Even the roads played peekaboo through neatly pruned hedges, and some Celtic crosses look as though they've been scattered by the little people, as my grandfather would say. Everything had a kind of between the rain showers look. Truly it seemed as I was in a giant's formal garden. Ireland was unbelievably green and park-like. The weather was cool and misty, just like I'd always dreamt of. The people we saw were a weather-beaten, muddy-faced crew. They seemed to have a kind of uniform. All of them wore golfers' caps and vests, dressed as though they were merely pitching in, and this wasn't really their jobs. I had the impression that they had stepped in on the way out to church. They transferred over to Framlingham, which was the base in eastern England, where my father was stationed. On the 31st of May, we made an all-day train ride through Cambridge and Ipswich to Suffolk. Of course, there was a foul-up, and we almost went to Norwich by mistake. In the early afternoon, we first saw Yank formations returning from their combat missions. I leaned out of the train's window and twisted my neck for a view. I was reminded of the wild fowl in the duck club back home. I couldn't help wondering if they were really wild geese or just sitting ducks. Believe me, this wasn't the last time I wondered the same thing.